Thank you, Emma, and good evening, everyone. So, relationships. Let's talk a little bit about relationships. As young people progress through secondary school, you're likely to find that they might start forming those relationships. And this can be quite an overwhelming experience for us as a parent because it's new. How much do we get involved? How many questions do we ask? Well, we feel that it's really important to ask your young people questions about their relationship, mainly to make sure that their relationship is healthy, safe, and appropriate, but to also show that you're interested in their life and who they're connecting with. So, really try and think about what you need to know, such as how they met their partner or maybe how old they are. Do remember that it's very normal now for young people to meet online, even when they're in school. But also remember that meeting online, of course, comes with those additional risks. So if your young person has met their boyfriend or their girlfriend online and they're yet to meet face to face, it is important that some safety planning, of course, comes alongside this. We would always recommend that an adult is present for this meeting. They may not want you there, but it's okay to remind them that you are the parent and you do set the rules. You could even suggest that they meet somewhere like Costa and you're also in there but on a separate table. This might reduce some of that embarrassment for the young person, but they know that you're there if you do need them. Even if they haven't met online, try and get to know them. Take that opportunity to meet your young person's love interest and get to know them that little bit more. You could ask your teenagers questions like, how do they treat you? What is it that you like best about them? And what do you like doing with them? Opening up that conversation from the start is really important in case anything was to go really wrong. They know that you care about their relationship and that you're there to help them. So I want to start this next section just by reminding you all, as parents, that most relationships that our young people will enter will be healthy, safe, and supportive. But just a bit of a warning, I will be spending around the next kind of 10 to 15 minutes talking about unhealthy and abusive relationships. So this is just a little bit of a health warning that if this sounds like it will be a triggering topic to you or an upsetting topic, please do feel free to put me on mute, make yourself a cup of tea, and then come back once we've moved on to the next topic in, like I said, about 10 or 15 minutes. So I guess if I was to say the words domestic abuse, we'd all have a pretty similar picture in our heads. We might automatically think about physical violence occurring particularly within adult relationships. But the reality is domestic abuse is much, much more than that. Domestic abuse can, of course, happen to anyone, and that's anyone of any age, any gender, religion, class, or ethnicity. But tonight, we will just be focusing on young people. So Safe Lives, which are a national domestic abuse charity, collect all of the statistics and data around domestic abuse. And their most recent research has found that 25% of girls and 18% of boys aged between 13 and 17 have experienced some form of physical violence from an intimate partner. They also found that 31% of girls have experienced some form of sexual abuse, sexual violence, or sexual harassment within their relationships. And sexual harassment can be anything from using sexually insulting language to something more extreme, such as rape. So I appreciate that these statistics are shocking, very upsetting, and we're probably all sitting here potentially quite worried about our young person's relationships. But please try and remember that we're still not talking about the majority of young people here. And according to the statistics, it's still more likely that your child will experience a healthy relationship rather than an unhealthy relationship. But it happens. It might not necessarily happen to your young person, but you might notice warning signs in what they tell you about their friends' relationships, for example. Domestic abuse is often hidden and there is a huge stigma around it. So opening up that conversation at home can be really helpful in that way to kind of start breaking down that taboo and helping your young person to engage in these open conversations. So let's start with what domestic abuse actually is. So according to our legal definition, domestic abuse is an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening, degrading, or violent behaviour. So the power and control wheel, which should currently be on your screen right now, can really help us to understand this definition further. So these different sections of the wheel help us to understand how someone could gain power and control over another person. I won't go through all of these with you tonight, but I think it's important that we do touch on the ones that are most prevalent in young people's relationships. So I'm going to start with using intimidation. So using intimidation, that means using scary behaviour that would leave the other person in the relationship feeling fearful, walking on eggshells, or scared to put a foot wrong. So this can be something as simple as the way that they look at the other person to damaging property, smashing things, throwing objects around, or throwing things at the wall. Then we've got emotional abuse. So emotional abuse is potentially the most common type of abuse. So 91% of people who have been in an abusive relationship report there to have been some level of emotional abuse involved within their relationship. So emotional abuse in teenagers could be things like put downs, name calling, playing mind games. You might hear emotional abuse be referred to as things like psychological abuse, and can also fall under that category of verbal abuse as well. Then we've got isolation. So isolation is also very commonly seen within abusive relationships. But in terms of young people's relationships, this will often involve them making the other partner feel bad, and that's for things like seeing their friends, for example. However, please do remember that within teenage relationships especially, it's often very normal for them to want to spend all of their time with their new partner, especially if the relationship is new. But isolation is different because there will be some level of fear involved. So the victim in the relationship would likely feel scared as to what would happen if they don't spend all of their time with their partner. Then we've got using coercion and threats. So coercive control only actually became a crime in 2015. It's obviously something that has always been around, but it involves much more of a pattern of behaviours rather than that one-off incident. So this pattern normally results in the abusive behaviours getting worse as time goes on and can leave that victim feeling trapped. Commonly in young people, we tend to see the threat of suicide, that if the victim ended that relationship, then the abusive person may threaten to end their own life, for example, which is obviously a huge pressure on that other young person within the relationship. And other behaviours that would fall under this category could include things like threats, and that's either making that threat or carrying it out, such as a threat to share nude pictures or spread rumours about them. So on your screen now is the cycle of abuse. So the cycle of abuse shows that typical pattern that occurs within abusive relationships. So starting from the top, any relationship will normally start at the honeymoon phase, which is absolutely no different within an abusive relationship. So on your screen now, that's just at the bottom of the cycle of abuse, the honeymoon phase. So during this phase, everything is so lovely. There might be a lot of gift giving and a lot of positive time spent together. This stage is really, really exciting, especially for our young people when relationships are new to them. Generally speaking, in healthy relationships, this phase might fade out slightly, but the relationship will then stay at a calm phase. However, in unhealthy or abusive relationships, they will then go round to that tension building phase. So when we've worked with victims before, they've described to us that this phase is like walking on eggshells, for example. So they might know that an abusive episode is brewing, but they're often not sure on when this will occur or what in particular might trigger it. This phase can last for minutes, hours, or even days. The victim will often feel quite hyper aware to the abusive person in this phase and try and manage their own behaviour to reduce the kind of likelihood of that abusive episode, happening. So we then come around to that abusive incident, which can be physical, emotional, or sexual. And then we see that cycle repeat itself, and repeat itself. So victims often report that the abusive person will minimise, deny, or blame after that abusive incident has occurred. So they might do this by saying things like, "I hardly touched you," so that would be minimising. They might refuse to acknowledge that it happened, so they might say something like, "You're making it up, I never did anything wrong." Or they might blame, so that would be saying things like, "Well, if you didn't upset me, I wouldn't have done it." Within abusive relationships, we see that honeymoon phase is really often quite exaggerated. So again, it might involve lots of gift giving and a real outpouring of love. So this cycle of abuse that you can see on your screens and that I've just explained can really help us to understand why young people may stay in relationships that aren't healthy. Yes, we have those two phases that are abusive, but we also have this honeymoon and calm phase. So it can be really, really difficult to break this cycle. And that's because it's really unlikely that young people are going to want to leave when things are really nice and really calm in that honeymoon phase. But also it's very difficult and can be quite unsafe to leave in that tension building or that abusive phase. So how can we actually know if a young person is in an abusive relationship? We know that everyone and every relationship is so different, but here are some common signs that you might see within your young person that might be a warning that their relationship is either abusive or unhealthy. So one sign we might see is some physical signs. So think about bruising, especially if bruising is unexplained, or think about kind of red marks that might look quite new and quite fresh or even slightly older. Think about them being overly defensive of their partner. Think about them having a drastic change in their behaviour or mood, and that might be kind of a real sudden low mood or anxiety, or even the total opposite, such as exaggerated confidence. Be alert for them being kind of overly secretive, not wanting to tell you too much. I spoke at the start about really trying to get to know your young person's partner. If they're not willing to share with you things like their age, what they do, if they have a job, their history, things about their family, think about why that might be. Watch out for them kind of constantly being on their phone. I know that teenagers always seem to constantly be on their phone, but think about kind of their body language while they're on their phone. So are they seeming quite frightened if they're on their phone, or quite on edge when they receive a text message, for example? We do know that these can be really common and normal behaviours that we see from young people. So the key to look out for is change. So you know your young person better than anyone else. Has their behaviour really suddenly changed? And are you seeing a few of these signs together? If so, always trust your gut in these situations. As I've said, you know your young person better than anyone. So at this point in the session, it feels that the world is pretty gloomy. But please remember, like I said, it is unlikely that your young person is experiencing all of these problems or even any of them at all. But knowledge really is power here, and it's important that we talk about these issues because they are stigmatized and they are hidden. Domestic abuse and sexual harassment or assault all involve people pushing or even totally disregarding the boundaries that our young people have.